Okay, so Unit 1 will be discussing constitutional underpinnings and federalism. And as far as the textbook is concerned, we'll be focusing on chapters 2 and 3. And those will be the main chapters you'll be assessed on. Chapter 1 will be helpful to know, but I won't be directly assessing you on it. So, first off, we're going to establish what type of system we use here in the United States. And I would highly recommend watching this video. It's about 10 minutes long. It's a really good video, kind of explaining and questioning the types of government. So please take the time to watch that. But some of the things you're going to want to know are democracy, direct democracy, and republic, and kind of working on establishing what we have here in the United States. And so some questions to keep in mind are, why did the framers of the Constitution fear a direct democracy? And what is the difference between democracy, republic, and oligarchy? So in the United States, and I got a cartoon here. You can have Parker explain why that's such a funny cartoon. But the writers of the Constitution feared the ability of ordinary people to make informed judgments about what government should do. And remember, it's not the perfect government, it's the best government. And that was the goal, is to make the best government. And it's kind of this idea of, I don't know if you've seen Men in Black, but there's a part where, I think his name is Jay, he's like, a person is smart, but people are dumb, panicky, dangerous animals. And I would tend to agree with that, a person is going to think things through and make a rational decision, but when you get a group of people together, that's when things become a bit more irrational. And so the founders wanted to help take power away from the people so that they couldn't make too many irrational decisions. So, some traditional democratic theories. And I understand I'm going a little bit quick, but you can pause this at any point and play it back. So, first off, in a proper democracy, we need to abide by the one person, one vote principle. They used to say vote early, vote often, back at the turn of the century. That was kind of a joke against the political machine and encouraging voter fraud. The goal is one person. Every person gets a vote, and every vote counts the same. And that's one of the problems that people have with the Electoral College, is that some states, like we saw in the video, states like Wyoming or Montana that have smaller populations have a disproportionate vote. And so that's one of the arguments in favor of getting rid of the Electoral College. Anyway, citizens need adequate and equal opportunities to express their preferences throughout the process. And so some people argue and claim that we do not have we don't check in on politicians enough, that they're not held accountable. That's kind of the point of a midterm election. I mean, to get anything done in less than 2 years is a little bit ridiculous, if you ask me. And so that 2 years is kind of enough time to give them a chance to make some change. It's got to be a marketplace for ideas, meaning ideas are being freely exchanged, and that the government doesn't monopolize what people can talk about. And that's where the First Amendment comes into play, and that's really the essence of it, is keeping that marketplace open so that we can exchange ideas and criticize the government itself. Citizens should collectively control the agenda of the government. No one group should have its voice louder than the whole, kind of like you might see in an oligarchy, but also kind of back to the one person, one vote as well. And that can be an issue with gerrymandering, where you deliberately misdraw lines to impact the outcome of an election. You may change people's voices within different congressional districts. And then lastly, rights need to be extended to include all citizens. If you're only hearing the voices of some people, you're really not going to be able to accurately represent everybody. And I think that that seems pretty straightforward. So then we get into this idea of the distribution of power, and this is something that is a little bit tricky because distribution of power can refer to within our government, as in the, well, no, I guess we would call that the separation of power still. But I guess that's what you don't want to get it mixed up. So don't think of distribution of power in the same way you think of the separation of power. Distribution is sort of the distribution between federal, state, and local governments, where separation is dealing with the separation between the different branches of government. And so the three types, or the three ways that we distribute power around the world are unitary governments, federal governments, and confederate governments. And in a unitary, central government holds all the power. The United Kingdom is a good example of a unitary government. Federalist government, like we have here in the United States, the federal government shares power with smaller local governments. And when we say local in this context, we're really talking about the state governments, who then delegate to the local governments. But the shared power between states and the nation, or the federal government, and actually only 11 out of 190 nations use this federalist system. The unitary government is by far the most common. And then lastly, we have a confederate government, and that's a loose alliance of states. The states kind of govern themselves, but then work together for common causes. It could be economic, it could be military, those types of things. So, the characteristics of a state. I don't know that this necessarily comes up on the AP test, but I think it's kind of good stuff to know, and I think it might help with critical thinking if you got to a question that you weren't too sure on. First off, you need population. Duh, if there's no people there, then you're not going to have a government or a state. Second, territory. Again, duh, if you don't have any land, then how can you be a government? How can you have anybody to govern? Then we get into sovereignty. And sovereignty has to be supreme and absolute power within its own territory, and it has to be able to decide its own foreign and domestic policies. And then we need a government, obviously. A government in a nation, it must be politically organized in order to make and enforce policies. And remember, public policy is the passing of laws and the allocation of resources. So you kind of need those four things, and I think they're kind of straightforward, but it's helpful to go through and define so that we can make sure we're on the same page. So some of the philosophers. Yeah, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Charles de Montesquieu, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And as you look through, you'll see a lot more of the last three in our government. Thomas Hobbes didn't really trust man. He kind of said that they were brutish, or man is inherently brutish and ruthless. And so if you think back to the beginning of the semester when we were trying to define sort of human nature, that's what Hobbes would say. He would say that men are brutish, and the only way to govern them is through one absolute monarch who can make any and all executive decisions. John Locke is kind of the opposite of that. Life, liberty, and property are natural rights granted by God, and you may recall those from the Declaration of Independence. Basically, he's saying that he says that if government does not respect these rights, then it is the duty of man to revolt. So he says that if your life, liberty, and property are not being respected by your government, it's not like, hey, maybe we should revolt. He's saying that it is your duty as a citizen of that nation to revolt against the government. Charles de Montesquieu, he advocates for the separation of power, which we see in our Constitution, and is discussed in Federalist 51. And then lastly, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The only good government was freely formed with consent of the people. And this idea of legitimacy, I think, is something that we're gonna look at here in the next slide. So, legitimacy. What makes a nation legitimate? Is ISIS considered a legitimate nation? And I would say no. A common definition for legitimacy is consent of the governed, meaning that the people agree to your right to rule, and then recognition from other states. Consent is a difficult word to define, because I think you can make the argument that by not revolting or not fighting back, then you are giving consent. And so maybe you don't like your government, but if you don't do anything to change that, then I think you are giving that government consent to rule. And then we come to, well, then what is the proper role of government? And hopefully you watched that video at the beginning of these slides, and that's kind of what the role of the Constitution is to limit the government to its proper role of protecting the people from the government. And so, according to Locke, we have, the government's job is to provide laws that tell us whether or not our behavior is acceptable. And also, it's important to him that property is not taken without consent. And that's evident. You should double check this, but I want to say it's the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. When it talks about due process, I believe one of the clauses in there deals with not taking our property without just compensation. Unfortunately, the government is responsible for determining whether or not that compensation is just, but it is what it is, I suppose. Anyway, according to the founding fathers, the proper role of government is to address human nature, the causes of political conflict, the objects of government, and the nature of government. And these are really going to be evident in our Constitution and will make more sense after we read Federalists 10 and 51 next week. So human nature, kind of the idea that it needs to address the fact that man acts in his own self-interest, and that if we don't have rules in place to prevent that from happening, then we need to have rules in place to prevent one person from taking over in their own self-interest. Addressing the causes of political conflict, those are what are known as factions. Those will be defined in Federalist 10, but in our government, again, this will all start to come together as we get to that portion of the unit. Addressing the objects of government, essentially what that means is the economic protection from the government. When you look at the Constitution, you're going to see that a lot of the rules that are put in place in our Constitution are really promoting a free market system and keeping the government from getting too involved in the economy. And then lastly, we have addressing the nature of government, power versus power. That's going to connect you to Federalist 51 very closely. I don't want to spoil anything, because Madison has some pretty beautiful quotes in that piece. So that'll do it for part 1.